The silence of Solax 9 was unbroken, its frozen landscape stretching far beyond what the eye could see, a land untouched by time or life. The planet was a graveyard, a testament to the hostile environment that had wiped it clean of anything. Organic. No plant, no animal, no microbe clung to its surface, and yet for all its desolation, it called to those who dared venture into the void. Solax 9 was the kind of world that attracted explorers and dreamers, those driven by the thrill of discovery, even when the planet offered nothing but an unforgiving, alien embrace. Among these explorers was Dr. Ilara Carter, an experienced astronaut and the mission's lead researcher. Ilara's mission was supposed to be a routine survey, nothing more than the latest in a series of boring and repetitive explorations designed to confirm that the universe beyond humanity's reach was as empty and inhospitable as scientists had long suspected. There were no grand discoveries waiting for her. There was only dust and dead rock, but Ilara didn't mind. To her, the quiet beauty of a barren world held its own allure. The alien stillness of it all provided clarity, a rare feeling in a galaxy filled with noise and chaos. Solax 9 was just another stop on her long career, another tiny piece of the great cosmic puzzle. She'd gather her data, catalogue her findings, and move on. At least that was the plan. Her boots crunched against the icy terrain as she made her way to the research outpost, a high-tech facility perched at the edge of a vast, jagged canyon. The equipment she'd need for her work had already been set up, ready for inspection. The team of scientists orbiting the planet had sent their data ahead, and she would process it all, run tests, and confirm their earlier findings. It was an ordinary day, with nothing extraordinary expected, until the first anomaly appeared on her radar. Ilara paused, frowning at the flashing display on her wrist console. A single red dot blinked on the screen, somewhere deep below the surface of Solax 9. It wasn't supposed to be there. This part of the planet had been thoroughly scanned before, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, beneath the surface. The readings were clear, the terrain was sterile. So what was causing this blip? She hesitated for a moment, the thrill of curiosity clawing at her insides. A mistake. It had to be a glitch. But no, the data was too specific, too precise. She felt the familiar pull, the call of the unknown, that primal instinct that every explorer carried. What if this was it? What if this anomaly was the discovery she'd been waiting for her entire career? After all, how often did one stumble upon something that might rewrite everything they knew about the universe? Without hesitation, she keyed in the command to deploy a secondary scanning drone aimed directly at the signal's coordinates. Minutes passed in tense silence as she watched the drone's readings on the console. The red dot moved again. It was real. A chill ran down her spine. Could it be some kind of unknown life form? A subterranean organism? Or was it something else, something worse? Ilara's mind raced with possibilities. She toggled the communication, linked to the research crew in orbit, only to find the signal dead. Static buzzed in her earpiece, and then nothing. Her stomach twisted. She tried again. No response. With the nearest backup team light years away, Ilara was left alone to investigate. She had no choice. Her curiosity would not allow her to turn back. The mission was hers to command, and it was her responsibility to follow through. The more she thought about it, the more she knew the truth. Whatever was down there, she had to see it for herself. She grabbed her gear, a high-powered flashlight, environmental sensors, and a portable AI assistant that would guide her through the more technical aspects of the journey, and set off toward the coordinates. The wind howled across the desolate surface of Solax 9, pushing at her back as if urging her forward, as if the planet itself were watching her approach. Her boots sank slightly into the icy crust, and the planet's cold grasp seemed to tighten around her with each step. The canyon loomed ahead, dark and jagged, swallowing the horizon in its deep, inky shadows. In the heart of the canyon, she found the entrance to an underground system, a series of tunnels carved into the planet's rock. Her sensors picked up faint signs of radiation coming from within, a bizarre signature that was unmistakably artificial. This wasn't just a natural cave system. A thrill of unease stirred within her. The signal from the surface wasn't the only anomaly she had encountered. The radiation readings, odd, out of place, suggested that someone or something had been here long before humanity arrived. Her heart pounded, and the reality of what she was about to do sank in. She wasn't alone. The deeper she went into the tunnels, the more the world above seemed to vanish. The walls closed in, their dark, jagged edges seeming to pulse with an unnatural energy, and the air grew thin and stale. Her flashlight flickered, casting elongated shadows that seemed to twitch in her peripheral vision. Every step she took felt heavier, the air growing colder and more oppressive. And then, there it was, a faint, flickering light in the distance. It was a single pinprick of illumination coming from the heart of the tunnels. Ilara's pulse quickened as she approached, her mind racing. The source of the light wasn't natural. Someone or something was down here. She rounded a corner, and there it stood, a spacecraft. At first, she couldn't believe her eyes. It was partially buried in the rock, its metallic surface rusted and damaged by the years, but there were unmistakable signs of a human design. Ilara took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat. It was a reconnaissance ship, a model she recognized from old records. It had been lost years ago during a deep space survey mission. The crew had vanished without a trace, and the ship was presumed destroyed. Yet here it was, intact, sitting in the dark like a forgotten ghost. A shiver crawled up her spine. How had it gotten here? Then, as if the ship had been waiting for her, a movement caught her eye. She froze. Something or someone was inside. Her heart hammered against her chest. A voice in her mind screamed at her to leave, to retreat, but her body ignored it. She was already walking toward the ship. Every instinct in her told her this was the moment, the discovery she had been waiting for. But it came with a warning she couldn't ignore. The figure inside shifted again. Someone was still alive, and that was when Ilara knew. Her mission had just changed forever. Ilara stood at the threshold of the rusted reconnaissance ship, her breath shallow, her heart racing. The figure inside, the movement, the sound, had sent her pulse into overdrive. Something was alive, something was waiting for her. Her flashlight trembled in her hand, casting long, jagged shadows across the ship's hull. She stepped closer, each footfall echoing in the eerie silence, her breath becoming shallow. There was no sound from within, no voice, no sign of life beyond that strange shifting. It was as though the ship was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back, but that was a thought she could not entertain, not now. Not when something, someone, was waiting for her. In a place where no human should have been, she reached out a trembling hand to the door. It was jammed, the metal corroded by time and neglect. She gritted her teeth, pushing her strength into it. The door groaned in protest, and after a moment of resistance, it slid open with a violent screech that made her wince. Inside it was dark, the light from her flashlight revealing little more than twisted, empty frames of what had once been equipment. The air was thick with dust and the faint, acrid smell of oxidized metal. There were no signs of life. Nothing moving. Nothing breathing. But Ilara wasn't alone. She knew it. Her flashlight swept over the interior. There was a figure sitting in the pilot's chair, hunched over in a strange, unnatural position. It was human, or at least it appeared to be. The figure was dressed in what looked like the remnants of a spacesuit, the fabric torn and stained with age, the helmet cracked and absent. As Ilara stepped closer, she felt a cold chill run down her spine. The figure was not moving, not breathing. It was a corpse. Her heart sank as the realization hit her. This wasn't a rescue mission. This wasn't some miraculous survivor from a forgotten crew. This was a grave. She took a step forward, instinctively reaching out to check for a pulse, though she knew it would be useless. As her fingers brushed the figure's cold, lifeless arm, her mind whirred. The readings she had picked up on the surface, the radiation, the strange anomaly, it all made sense now. The wreckage, the ship, the signal, the corpse, they were connected. But how? And why was there another presence? There was something wrong with this place. Suddenly, she heard it again, the soft scratching noise. It was louder now, and unmistakably nearer. She spun around, flashlight flickering against the wall. The ship seemed to groan as though it were waking from a long slumber. Then something moved. At first, Ilara thought it was another trick of her mind. She had been alone for too long, drifting into the madness that often accompanies isolation. But no, she saw it clearly. A shadow, fast and fluid, darted across the interior of the ship like something out of a nightmare. It was in the corner, a pale form, crouched low. Her mind went blank with terror. Not another body, but when her flashlight swung toward it, she saw it wasn't a body at all. It was a figure, a human figure, but it was wrong. The man, or whatever it was wearing the same spacesuit as the other crew members, yet his appearance was distorted. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like he was struggling to move. His face was hidden beneath a cracked visor, but Ilara could make out a faint, sickly glow emanating from within. His mouth moved in rapid, frenzied gestures, but no words came. Out Ilara felt her breath catch. The rational part of her mind told her it was impossible. This couldn't be happening. There was no way that someone had survived down here. But as the figure shifted forward, revealing its hollow eyes and twitching limbs, the impossible became undeniable. This wasn't a survivor. It wasn't even human anymore. It was something else. Her instincts kicked in, flooding her with the desperate urge to flee. The scratching continued, louder now, as if it were coming from within her own skull, making her mind unravel. She tried to back away, but the door, the only way out, slammed shut, its automated systems engaging with an unnatural speed. Panic surged within her. Ilara's mind raced, searching for an explanation. This wasn't part of the mission. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had come here to survey, not to confront. Whatever this was, the distorted figure took another jerky step toward her. The air seemed to thicken with an oppressive weight, as though the ship itself were closing in around her, suffocating her. The faint glow from the figure's visor flickered, and Ilara could see a grotesque reflection of herself in its cracked surface, a mirror image, but somehow wrong, distorted. In that moment, she understood. This wasn't a rescue mission. This wasn't an accident. This was something far worse. A voice, faint, distant, like a whisper carried on the wind, began to speak. The words were garbled, incoherent, but Ilara's heart stilled because she recognized the language. It was human. It was her own language. "Help me," the voice whispered, but the voice wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from somewhere beneath the ship. From the walls, the floor, the very bones of the ship itself. The whispers were no longer just words. They were thoughts, a pull, a call. The figure's limbs twitched and jerked again, his body contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. But still, his gaze remained fixed on her. His eyes, hollowed out and glowing, were locked with hers. "Help me," it repeated, though its voice was growing fainter as if it were being drawn into the ship itself. "Help us!" A wave of cold rushed over Ilara as the walls began to hum. The temperature in the ship dropped, as if the vessel had been awakened from a deep slumber, and now it was hungry. The ship itself felt alive, as though it were feeding on her presence. Then the power flickered, everything went dark. For one harrowing moment, the only sound was her own ragged breathing, the quickened beat of her heart, and the distant creeping. Whispers that continued, faint yet growing ever stronger. Then a soft click, like the turning of a lock, and the door to the ship opened once again. Elara didn't hesitate. She didn't question the sudden change in the environment. She bolted, her legs carrying her through the darkened corridor, out into the freezing cold of the canyon. The ship behind her stood still, silent once again, as if it had never been disturbed, but she couldn't shake the feeling. It was still there, and she wasn't alone anymore. Ilara's mind raced as she stumbled away from the wrecked ship, her breath shallow and frantic, her body cold despite the distant sun burning down from above. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something had awakened. She hadn't just encountered a derelict, abandoned ship. She had, unwittingly, become part of something far older, far darker than anything she had prepared for. The air around her felt heavy, as though it had thickened with unease, and the canyon walls seemed to loom closer, the jagged peaks pressing down on her like the fingers of something unseen, tightening. The ship, now dark and silent, was behind her, an abandoned husk. But she knew it was watching her. Elara pushed herself harder, fighting to ignore the sound of whispering voices, echoes in the back of her mind that grew louder with each step she took. It was as if the ship's presence had imprinted itself on her, haunting her. Thoughts following her every movement. She needed to get back to the rover. She needed to escape. Her boots crunched against the rocky terrain as she stumbled toward the location where she had parked the rover earlier. The sleek, futuristic vehicle was still there, its sunshield gleaming faintly, offering some semblance of comfort. But as Elara approached it, her pulse quickened. Something was wrong. The rover had been moved, a trail of broken rock, and disturbed. Dust led away from where the vehicle had been parked. It was subtle, so subtle that, had she been in any other state, she might have missed it. But Elara was sharp. She had spent enough time on alien worlds to know when something didn't add up. Someone or something had tampered with the rover. Her breath caught in her throat. The shadows around her seemed to shift and twist. She could feel it. The same chill, the same oppressive weight that had filled the ship, a presence, a predator. Forcing herself to take steady breaths, Ilara's hands moved to the rover's controls, but before she could engage the system, something caught her eye. Something reflected in the window. A faint glimmer, a small, crackling distortion in the air. For the briefest of moments, it felt like the air itself had rippled, as though the space around her had briefly broken. Her mind raced. It wasn't the atmosphere. This planet didn't have that kind of anomaly. It wasn't the tech either. The rover was built to withstand the most extreme environmental conditions. What she had just witnessed, it was something else entirely. Before she could react, the whispers grew louder. The sound rose from the depths of the canyon, curling around her like a tightening noose. Her pulse thrummed in her ears as she turned, sharply eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, barely visible against the rising sun, something moved. A figure. It was humanoid, but it moved with an unnatural fluidity. The shape seemed to shimmer at the edges, as though reality itself had been warped around it. Ilara's heart skipped a beat as she realized that it wasn't one of the crew members she had come here to find. This figure was different. A sound, like crackling static, filled the air, and the figure paused, its head tilting slightly in her direction. A low, almost guttural hum emanated from it, vibrating the air. There was a cold, unsettling familiarity to it. And that's when it hit her. It was mimicking her movements. The figure was copying her, mirroring her every twitch, every breath, but it wasn't the same. There was something wrong about it. Ilara's instincts screamed at her to run, to flee, but She couldn't. Her body was frozen, as if the very air around her had turned to lead. The creature's presence was suffocating, its essence pressing against her chest. She knew it wasn't merely mimicking her, it was learning from her. It was adapting. She backed away slowly, her boots scraping against the dust as she moved. But as she did, something flashed in her peripheral vision, another figure, and then another. More. Ilara's heart stuttered in her chest. The figures were everywhere, each one indistinct at first, only half-formed at the edges of her vision. Yet as they grew clearer, she could see their forms, humanoids, but not quite. They seemed to shimmer, their bodies distorting in and out of focus, as though they were caught between worlds. And then she saw them more clearly. Creatures with hollow eyes, their faces devoid of emotion. Their limbs twisted unnaturally, their movements jerky, as if they were still adjusting to a form they didn't understand. They were like the distorted figure she had seen on the ship, the one whose voice had whispered at the edge of her mind. But there was something different, something off about them. They weren't fully alien, but they were not human either. They were something else. A ripple ran through the air again, and then the ground shuddered. Ilara barely had time to react. As the first of the figures lunged at her, its limbs moved too quickly, too unnaturally, like a predator striking. It grabbed her by the arm, its fingers cold and unyielding, its grip impossibly tight. The moment it touched her, she felt a sickening jolt in her mind, a sensation like her thoughts were being pulled away. The creature's face was blank, its hollow eyes wide and emotionless. And yet, there was something behind those eyes, a hunger, a deep gnawing emptiness that spoke of a terrible intelligence. She screamed, trying to pull away, but the creature's grip tightened, pulling her closer. The other figures moved in with unnatural speed, circling her like wolves around prey, their presence suffocating. But Ilara refused to give in. She refused to become their victim. With a desperate, violent wrench, she freed herself from the creature's grip, stumbling backward. The force of the movement knocked her to the ground, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She scrambled for the rover's controls again, her fingers trembling as she slammed them into place. The engines roared to life. For a brief moment it seemed like she might make it. The rover surged forward, its wheels kicking up dust as it barreled toward the canyon's edge. But as Ilara's breath caught in her throat and she looked back, she saw the figures following. They were moving in a perfect formation, a unity in their terrifying motion, as if they were connected by a single sinister mind. Ilara's heart pounded as she floored the accelerator, desperate to put as much distance between her and them as possible. But the canyon was narrow, too narrow. She needed to escape, and fast. But there was one thing that was becoming increasingly clear. She wasn't just running from the figures anymore. She was running from something far greater, something older, more powerful, and more insidious than she had ever imagined. Whatever had awakened in that ship was now out in the world, and it wasn't going to let her go. The rover tore through the narrow canyon, its wheels grinding over jagged rocks and uneven ground. Ilara's pulse thundered in her ears, the hum of the engines a backdrop to the rising terror coiling in her chest. She glanced in the rearview mirror, only to see the distorted figures still pursuing her, their bodies flickering in and out of. Focus as though reality itself couldn't fully contain them. Her hands tightened around the wheel, knuckles white with tension. The rover's sensors were picking up the growing anomaly, a ripple in the air that seemed to shift in time with each turn. The air had become thick with static, a low hum that vibrated her bones, making every breath feel labored. She could feel them closing in on her, tracking her. Ilara's eyes darted ahead. The canyon ahead of her was narrowing, the cliffs on either side rising sharply like the jaws of some ancient beast. Her options were dwindling. The path ahead was about to close off entirely. She needed to make a decision, and fast. Her mind raced through every possible escape. There was no way she could outrun them, not in the rover, not in this narrow canyon. But there was something else, something on the horizon that might give her a chance. She pulled the rover into a sharp turn, the tires skidding as she pushed the vehicle toward the unexplored side of the canyon. There, barely visible in the distance, was an opening. A jagged fissure in the stone, just wide enough for the rover to fit through if she timed it right. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. The figures, like shadows in the distance, mirrored her every move, each one a reflection of her desperation, an echo of her every turn, every calculation. They were getting closer, their hollow eyes gleaming with an unspoken intelligence. Their pursuit was relentless, and it was no longer just a chase. It was something more, something personal. As Ilara surged the rover forward, her heart in her throat, the figures seemed to split. Two went to the left, two to the right, surrounding her from all sides. It was as if they were trying to box her in, to trap her in their web. No way out. Her fingers flew over the controls, activating every system, the rover's shields coming online, the energy levels spiking as the engines screamed beneath her. The ground beneath her vibrated once again, this time with a deep, resonating hum that seemed to originate from below. It felt like the planet itself was beginning to awake. Then the first shockwave hit. It wasn't just a tremor, it was a force, a violent pulse of energy that slammed into the rover like a blow. Ilara's head whipped to the side as the impact rattled her bones. The vehicle lurched, nearly losing control. The figures, now clear and fully formed, closed in from all directions, their movements disturbingly precise, almost mechanical, in nature. But there was something new, something that made Ilara's stomach drop. From within the distorted figures, a shape emerged, taller, more imposing. Its outline was unclear, a mass of shifting light and shadow. But one thing was unmistakable. Its presence was overwhelming. It wasn't just mimicking her anymore. It had become her, or at least it had become what she was. Her reflection. Ilara's breath caught as she fought the rover to the opening ahead. The fissure was narrowing. She didn't have much time. The shape's form became more defined. And she saw it. Its face, no longer a blank mask, now bore the same hollow eyes as the figures that surrounded her. It grinned, its mouth, stretching unnaturally wide, as if to swallow everything in its path. The shape was a reflection of herself, yet it was twisted, warped into something monstrous. She couldn't stop it. She couldn't escape. Her hands slammed the controls, triggering the rover's full throttle speed. The engine screamed, the vehicle rocketing forward with all its might. The canyon walls seemed to press in closer. The opening ahead, a narrow, precarious path that might either lead to freedom or doom. As she neared the fissure, the distortion intensified, the air around her crackling with energy. The shadowy figures surged forward, their limbs moving like blades reaching for her. Her heart raced as she fought to keep the rover steady. She was too close. The walls of the canyon were almost too narrow for the vehicle to pass through. There was no room for error, and then a loud crack filled the air. The figures leapt, their arms stretching toward her with inhuman speed. Ilara's fingers clutched the wheel in a death grip. She braced for impact, but just before the creatures reached her, the fissure widened. A violent shockwave blasted from the depths of the canyon, as though the very earth was reacting to her desperate flight. The rover shot forward, breaking through the narrowing gap, the distortion and figures receding behind her. For a moment she felt weightless, like time itself had stopped. The figures tried to follow, but the opening slammed shut behind her with a deafening boom. The shockwave sent the creatures spiraling into the air like scattered debris. They weren't built to survive such forces. Ilara's pulse still raced as the rover flew into the darkness, but she didn't dare slow down. There was no telling how long the opening would remain closed or how long her makeshift escape would last. The shifting landscape behind her was growing dim, but she could still feel the presence of the creatures, now lost in the depths of the canyon, waiting for her return. But that was not her concern. Not anymore. As Ilara raced forward into the unknown, the dark opening ahead, swallowing the last light of the canyon, she realized the full magnitude of what she had uncovered. It wasn't just a ship, not just a planet. It was something far, more ancient. The forces at work here were not merely alien, but part of something much larger, cosmic in nature. And whatever had been unleashed on this planet was not the last of it. Ilara looked down at the rover's diagnostics. She was no longer in control of the situation. The very space around her seemed to warp, twitch, as though reality itself was unraveling. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. The rover's engines hummed softly, the only sound in the eerie stillness that enveloped Ilara as she sped through the vast expanse of the dark unknown. The sky above was a blanket of oppressive blackness, the stars mere pinpricks of light scattered across a void that seemed to stretch forever. Beneath her, the ground was uneven, jagged, and scarred, an alien landscape untouched by human hands. Yet there was something almost serene about the silence, as if the chaos she had just escaped had never existed, a brief memory fading into the distance. But Ilara knew better. The figures had been real. The distortion had been real. Everything she'd experienced was real. The problem was, she no longer had any idea what she was dealing with. The planet, or whatever entity had created this world, was far beyond her understanding. The creatures, her own twisted reflections, had been only the beginning. The fissure she had fled through was just one of many cracks, openings to a force that had been dormant for eons. And now that it had awakened, Ilara knew it would not rest until it consumed everything in its path. Her hand tightened around the rover's controls, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that the escape she had just made wasn't a victory. It was simply a delay, a reprieve. She had bought herself time, but not much. Not enough to really understand what had happened or how to stop it. And she knew she couldn't do it alone. The rover's readout blinked to life. She saw the coordinates of the distant facility, a research outpost on the planet's outer rim. It was her only hope of finding answers, of learning who, if anyone, knew about the forces she had uncovered. Maybe there were survivors. Maybe there was some kind of weapon, some way to fight back. But part of her knew that wasn't the real reason she was heading toward it. She was being drawn to it, like a moth to a flame. As she navigated through the rough terrain, her thoughts turned inward. The reflection, what she had seen in the canyon, what it had done, was still haunting her. It wasn't just a mirror image of herself. It was something deeper, something dark. That thing had become her. And worse, she had felt an undeniable sense of connection to it, as though its desires mirrored hers, its fears were hers. It knew her, better than she knew herself. But how? How could something so alien understand her so thoroughly? Ilara shuddered, the thought gnawing at her. She had barely survived, and now she was about to face the full consequences of the ancient forces she had unleashed. She didn't know what kind of monster she had disturbed, but she had a sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't finished with her yet. A few hours later, the research facility came into view, a massive, sprawling complex, its jagged architecture built into the cliffs of the planet's barren landscape. It looked almost deserted, save for the faint pulse of emergency lights that flickered at irregular intervals. She approached cautiously, the rover's engines winding down as she slowed to a stop at the entrance. There were no guards, no welcoming signals, just the dull hum of power running through the silent facility. The cold air around her felt thick with expectation, as though the ground beneath her was holding its breath. Stepping out of the rover, Ilara felt the oppressive silence press down on her. The facility, once a place of cutting-edge research and exploration, now felt like a tomb, its walls lined with the echoes of failed missions, of lost people. There were no signs of life, only the sense that something had gone terribly wrong. The planet had once promised humanity new answers, new frontiers, but it had delivered nothing but death. She moved deeper into the facility, her boots tapping softly on the cold metal floors. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the further she went, the more it felt like she was walking into the belly of the beast. She had to find out what had happened here. Why had this place been abandoned, and what exactly had they discovered? A faint noise echoed down the hall, footsteps or something like it. Ilara stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't expected anyone else to be here. The survivors, if there were any, had to be hiding. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Following the sound, she found herself in a control room, the glass panels cracked and the monitors displaying nothing but static. But then the screen flickered to life, showing a set of coordinates, the Sci-Fi, same ones she had seen earlier on her rover's console. They led to a location deep within the planet's core, but before she could make sense of it, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the air seemed to grow heavy with an unnatural weight. She spun around, her pulse quickening. The last thing she saw, before the lights blinked out completely, was the flickering image of a figure, a reflection of herself. Its eyes locked onto hers with an expression of cold, unnerving knowledge. Then the world went dark. The sound of Ilara's breath echoed softly within the confines of the darkened facility. Her body felt heavy, as though the weight of the planet itself was pressing down on her, but it was the oppressive silence that truly suffocated her. The flickering lights had long since gone out, leaving her in the pitch black, save for the glow from her helmet's visor. Her mind raced, replaying the chilling vision of her reflection. No, not a reflection. Something else. It had seen her, known her, and now it was coming for her. She stumbled through the dark halls, the eerie hum of machinery, the only sound that accompanied her footsteps. The control room lay abandoned, its console screens now blank. All of the data, the questions she had hoped to answer, had vanished into the void as quickly as it had appeared. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling, the undeniable sense, that the answers she sought were right there, just out of reach, hidden beneath the surface. Whatever had awakened in this place was intelligent, ancient, and far more powerful than she could ever have imagined. It understood her, and worse, it was using that understanding to manipulate her. A faint tremor shook the ground beneath her. Boots. At first, it seemed like a minor aftershock, the planet's unstable core shifting slightly, but then the tremor grew stronger. Earthquakes were common on planets like this, unstable ones, but this felt different, like something was waking up, something huge. Ilara felt a strange compulsion pull her toward the central chamber of the facility, a space she had avoided earlier, afraid of what she might find. As she moved toward it, the air grew colder, and the silence grew even more profound. Then she saw it, the core. A massive, spherical structure, pulsating with energy, nestled deep within the facility. It hummed with a resonance that made the very walls tremble. The distortion she had felt earlier was coming from here. It had been buried under miles of rock, hidden away from the universe for eons, but now it was awake, and it had been waiting. Ilara stepped closer, her heart pounding. This was it, the key to everything. She could feel it deep in her bones. The planet was alive. It wasn't just the forces beneath the surface. It was something greater, something alive in a way that transcended what humans had ever known. Then the voice came again. No, not a voice, but a thought. You are not alone. Ilara froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The reflection, the entity that had mirrored her, was here in the core. It was waiting for her to join it. The voice was not a command. It wasn't even an invitation. It was an inevitable truth, a reality that was unfolding with or without her consent. Suddenly, the lights in the chamber flickered on, and there, standing before her, was the last thing she expected to see. The reflection. But it wasn't a mere echo of her image anymore. It was something else entirely, something more. It was her, yes, but something distorted, something changed. The entity had taken shape, and now it was standing before her, its eyes gleaming with a knowing hunger. "You have already joined us, Ilara," it whispered, its voice colder than any space she had ever known. "There is no turning back now." The air thickened, the walls around her seemed to close in, and as the reflection reached toward her, Ilara realized the full truth. This wasn't a monster. It wasn't even an enemy. It was part of her, part of something far beyond humanity's comprehension. And it had been waiting. The core pulsed once more, and then everything went dark.